The blizzard that struck the high country above Cripple Rock in the winter of 1882 was the worst anyone in 3 counties could remember. The kind of storm that buried fence lines and stopped clocks and left ranchers checking their stock twice a night out of a fear too old to argue with. Amos Bridger had gone out at midnight on the second night of it to check his barn roof for the 3rd time and found, instead of a leak, a woman collapsed in the hay near his mare's stall, her boots gone, her feet blue-white with frost, and no earthly explanation for how she had come to be there at all. Her name, once he'd carried her inside and gotten enough brandy and blanket warmth into her to loosen her tongue, was Clara Wynne, and the story she told him over the following days, in careful, reluctant pieces, the way a person tells a story they are still deciding whether to trust anyone with, was not the story of a lost traveler at all, but the story of a woman who had walked 11 miles through a blizzard, rather than marry a man she despised. This is the story of the winter that brought them together, the debt of care neither of them planned to owe the other, and the spring that turned an accidental rescue into something neither of them had words for, until it was already too late to call it anything but love. Amos Bridger was 36 years old, widowed 4 years past when his wife Sarah died, bringing their stillborn son into a world that took them both within the same terrible night, and he had run his ranch alone since, competent and steady in the way of men who have learned to carry grief by simply refusing to set it down where it might trip them. He found Clara by lantern light, with her cheek pressed against the hay, her dress torn at the hem and soaked through, her stockinged feet already showing the waxy pale discoloration he recognized from a hard winter years back when he'd nearly lost 2 toes of his own to the same affliction. He carried her to the house without waking her fully, laid her by the stove, and worked her frozen feet with lukewarm water and patient, careful hands. The way an old trapper had once taught him was the only safe method for reviving frostbitten flesh without doing further damage through haste. She woke somewhere in the 2nd hour, disoriented and immediately frightened, pulling back from his hands before some part of her recognized the care in the gesture rather than a threat, and went still, watching him with wide, exhausted eyes that held more fear than the cold alone could account for. "You're safe," Amos said, keeping his hands visible and his voice low, the same tone he used gentling a spooked horse. "You walked into my barn sometime in the storm, and your feet took some frost, but I don't believe you'll lose anything if we keep working them careful. Nobody's going to trouble you here tonight." She studied him a long moment, weighing that promise against whatever had driven her out into a blizzard on foot, and finally allowed her shoulders to drop by a fraction, though the wariness in her eyes did not fully leave. "Clara," she said, her voice raw from cold. "Clara Wynne, I would be grateful for the water and the fire, and I would be considerably more grateful if you didn't ask, tonight, why I was walking." Amos honored that request for 3 full days, tending Clara's feet twice daily, feeding her broth and bread as her strength returned, and asking nothing beyond what the recovery itself required, while the blizzard outside made any further travel, hers or anyone else's, entirely impossible, regardless of what either of them wanted. He noticed things he didn't comment on, the fine quality of her torn dress beneath the damage, suggesting money rather than desperation, the way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, at any sudden movement near her, the particular reflex of someone recently and repeatedly frightened, and the careful, deliberate way she avoided mentioning any family who might be searching for her. On the 4th morning, with the storm finally breaking to a hard, clear cold outside, Clara offered the explanation unprompted, watching the fire rather than Amos while she spoke. "My husband died 8 months ago, of a fever that took half our timber camp along with him, and his brother Jed inherited the mill, and by the custom our town holds to, considered himself entitled to inherit me along with it," she said. "I refused the arrangement twice through my late husband's lawyer, and 3 nights ago Jed arrived at my door with the town preacher and considerably less patience for a 3rd refusal. You walked out into that storm rather than marry him," Amos said, understanding now the torn dress, the missing boots, A woman who had left in the middle of a confrontation with whatever she could grab, rather than plan a careful departure. I walked out a window, in point of fact, while Jed argued with the preacher about scheduling, Clara said, and something almost like dry humor crept into her voice, despite the grimness of the account. I did not plan my route with any particular care, which explains why I ended up half frozen in a stranger's barn, rather than somewhere sensible. I am considerably more grateful for that stranger's barn than I have any adequate way of expressing. Jed Wynn arrived 11 days later, once the roads cleared enough for travel, with 2 hired men and a legal document he insisted gave him authority over his late brother's widow, regardless of her own wishes in the matter, and found Amos waiting on the porch with an expression that made clear the document would need to be considerably more convincing than Jed apparently believed it to be. "I've come for my brother's widow," Jed said, not dismounting. "She belongs under my roof and my protection, whatever fool notions a stranger's kindness has put in her head. She's under my roof by her own choosing, and has been recovering from frostbite, bad enough that she nearly lost 2 toes to it," Amos said. "If you've got a legal claim, you're welcome to present it to the circuit judge in Cripple Rock, but I won't hand a woman over to a man she climbed out a window to escape, document or no document." Clara stepped onto the porch then, steadier on her feet than she'd been in weeks, and addressed Jed directly, with a composure that had clearly been building since the night of her escape. "The custom you're invoking has no standing in territorial law, Jed, whatever standing it holds in our timber camp's gossip, and I have already written to my late husband's lawyer in Denver requesting a formal ruling on the matter," she said. "I would suggest you wait for that ruling, rather than ride out here a second time to repeat an argument that failed the first time, under considerably less strenuous circumstances." Jed's composure slipped, the flicker of a man realizing his leverage was considerably thinner than he'd assumed, and he studied Amos and Clara standing together on the porch, a long moment before deciding, with visible reluctance, that a legal fight in Denver was a poorer use of his time than the confrontation he'd ridden out expecting. "This isn't settled," he said, wheeling his horse. "It will be, once the lawyer rules," Clara said, "and I intend that ruling to be considerably more thorough than you expect." The weeks following Jed's visit settled into a rhythm neither Amos nor Clara had quite anticipated, in which her recovery gave way gradually to genuine usefulness around the ranch. She proved handy with accounts and correspondence, having kept her late husband's mill ledgers for 3 years, and took over Amos's own badly neglected bookkeeping with a briskness that saved him considerable money he hadn't realized he was losing to careless arithmetic. In turn, Amos taught her to ride properly, to read weather off the western sky the way any rancher needed to, and to shoot a rifle competently enough that she no longer needed to depend entirely on his presence for her own safety. A lesson she requested specifically, and pursued with a seriousness that told him plainly she intended never again to be as vulnerable as she'd been the night she walked into his barn. They spoke, over those weeks, of things neither had discussed with anyone since their respective losses. Amos of Sarah, and the son he never held. Clara of a marriage that had been comfortable, rather than passionate, but genuinely kind. And of the particular grief of losing a decent man to fever, only to be treated, within months, as property to be redistributed among his relations. Neither of them rushed toward anything beyond friendship during those long winter evenings, both too recently and thoroughly burned by loss and obligation to trust anything that moved quickly. But something steady and unhurried was building between them, regardless of how carefully they avoided naming it. "You've never once asked what I intend to do once the lawyer's ruling arrives," Clara said one evening in February, watching Amos work a stiff piece of harness leather by the fire. "Whether I'll stay, or return to Cripple Rock, or start some new life entirely elsewhere." "Didn't seem like my business to rush," Amos said, not looking up from the leather. "You've had enough people deciding things about your future, without consulting you first. Figured the least I could do was let you arrive at your own conclusions in your own time." The ruling arrived in early March, definitive and entirely in Clara's favor. The territorial court found no legal standing whatsoever for Jed's claimed custom, confirmed Clara's independent ownership of her late husband's modest inheritance, separate from the mill itself, and closed the matter formally enough that Jed's lawyer sent a brief, resigned letter conceding the point, rather than pursuing further appeal. Clara read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then set it down and sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing the particular strange weight of a freedom finally confirmed on paper after months of uncertainty. "I am, as of this letter, entirely free to do as I choose," she said finally, looking up at Amos with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not the wariness of the first weeks, nor the careful friendship of the following months, but something more open and considered than either. "I find myself in the unusual position of having no obligation pulling me toward Cripple Rock, or away from this ranch, or toward any particular future at all, except whatever future I decide, entirely on my own terms, to build. That's a fair amount of freedom to hold all at once," Amos said carefully, understanding that whatever he said next mattered considerably more than his usual measured caution allowed for. "For what it's worth, I'd be glad if building that future involved staying on here, not out of any debt you owe me for the barn or the frostbite, but because I've come to look forward to your company in a way I haven't looked forward to anything since Sarah." Clara was quiet a moment, studying him with the same careful attention she'd given every decision since the night she climbed through a window into a blizzard. "I have been afraid, since Jed, of being wanted for what I could provide, rather than for myself," she said. "I find, rather to my relief, that your asking carries none of that particular flavor." Spring arrived properly in April, the snow finally releasing its grip on the high country, and Amos found Clara one morning standing at the same barn door where he'd carried her in half-frozen 4 months earlier, looking out over pastures beginning to green for the first time since the blizzard. She turned when he approached, and the smile she gave him held none of the careful reservation of the winter months, only a warmth that had been building, unspoken, since the ruling arrived. "I've been standing here, thinking about the woman who collapsed in that hay in December," she said, "and how little she resembled the woman standing here now, and how much of that difference I owe to a cowboy who asked nothing of her, beyond letting her heal on her own schedule. Didn't do anything particularly remarkable," Amos said. "Any decent man would have done the same, finding a half-frozen stranger in his barn." "Perhaps," Clara said, "though I have met considerably more men in my life who would not have, and I find I am no longer interested in comparing you to hypothetical decent strangers. Amos Bridger, when the actual man in front of me has spent 4 months earning something considerably more specific than general decency." She reached for his hand then, the first time she had initiated any such gesture between them, and held it plainly, without hesitation. "I find myself ready, if you're asking, to make this arrangement permanent, on my own terms and by my own choosing, same as everything else I've decided since that ruling arrived." Amos did not need to ask twice, understanding exactly what she was offering, and exactly how much it had cost her to arrive at offering it freely. "Then I'm asking," he said. "Plainly, same as you'd wanted asked." They married in May, in the ranch yard beneath a cottonwood just beginning to leaf out, with Amos's nearest neighbors, and Clara's own small circle of Cripple Rock friends, gathered to witness an arrangement that both of them insisted, to anyone who asked, had been building since December, rather than beginning with any single dramatic moment. Clara wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself over the preceding weeks, and Amos wore his one good coat, and neither of them minded at all that the wedding lacked the grandeur some might have expected of a woman who'd once run a timber mill's accounts. Jed did not attend and was not invited, and the absence troubled neither of them in the slightest, though word reached them eventually that he'd sold the mill within the year and moved on to some fresh scheme in a different territory entirely, his ambitions considerably diminished by a legal defeat he'd never fully recovered from. Clara's ledgers, by contrast, kept the ranch's accounts in better order than they had been in years, and her steady presence at the stove and the fireside filled a silence in the house that Amos had stopped noticing only because he'd grown so used to carrying it. That first night as husband and wife, standing together at the same barn door where the whole story had begun, Clara laughed softly at the particular strangeness of it, a courtship that had started with frostbite and a blizzard, ending in a spring wedding under a cottonwood tree. "I walked into your life quite literally at my worst possible moment," she said, "and you never once made me feel like less for arriving that way." "Reckon that's because I never once saw you as anything less," Amos said, and pulled her close against the evening chill, and neither of them looked back toward Cripple Rock or Jed Wynn or any of the winter's hardship again, because whatever future they were building now belonged entirely and only to the two of them.